All right. Okay, I think we're live. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Okay, we're gonna get all settled in. Hi guys. I hope you guys are all doing okay. I guess if it's morning or afternoon or whatever time it is where you're at. I just wanted to kind of say again hello and introduce myself. My name is Brittney and I am the West Coast Technical Sales Manager for Lallemand Brewing Products. I live here in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, and that's specifically Portland, Oregon. And before I dive in, I just kind of want to say thank you guys for, tuning into this live stream and taking time out of your day to kind of check out what we're doing. Excuse me. I really appreciate it, and I really want you guys to know that for Lallemand Brewing, we're still here to support, and that we still brew with you guys, and it just might be online now, so it's just maybe a little bit different than before, but we're all still here by phone, by text, by email, and now by live stream. So I really hope you guys are enjoying this. Last week, Andy did a really excellent job discussing the history and the production of lager beers. But today we're going to kind of shift gears a little bit, and we're going to be talking about yeast, specifically dried yeast. So I'm going to kind of go over the frequently asked questions that I've received over the past few years of doing this job, ranging from, production, rehydration, aeration, and things like this. So first, I just kind of want to let you guys know this is going to be a question format, and I'm going through these questions here. I have slides that I'm going to be going back and forth on, just to hopefully make that a bit more interesting. But because of this, I unfortunately am not able to clearly see my Facebook Live and all the questions and comments that are coming in with it. So I'm not going to be able to address any of these comments or questions till the very end, but please feel free to, when a question pops into your head, feel free to, say hi and or post that in and do whatever you need, okay? So we're going to just kind of dive right in, and we're going to start with the first question, which is, what is active dried yeast and how is it made? So I'm assuming by most of you guys tuning into the Lallemand Brewing page, you guys have a pretty clear understanding of dried yeast, or maybe you guys have used it before, or maybe you're just interested in wanting to know more. And I'm hoping that this can kind of provide a little bit more of the ins and outs on this back end of dry yeast and the production and stuff. So in the most simplest of terms, dry yeast are yeast with 90% of their moisture removed, yet they're still capable of resuming metabolic functions once they're rehydrated. So they're still a living cell. It's not inactivated. It's not freeze-dried, which is an assumption that I get usually. It's truly an active yeast cell. It's just kind of in this dried, dormant kind of format. So the next question is that I receive after this is, how is active dried yeast produced? So I kind of have a slide to show you guys this, but I'm going to go over the steps really quickly first, and then I'm going to go over to the slides so you guys can follow through. I'm a visual learner. I kind of like seeing diagrams, so I'll be kind of showing you guys that as well. But for right now, in the beginning, dried yeast production, right? So you start in your lab, and we have a culture, and we pull yeast from this culture collection, and then we kind of prop this yeast up, very similar to that of kind of a brewery propagation, right? But then we do that, so then we get it on this much larger scale. And once we get up to that larger scale, we do a fed batch propagation, and that's this kind of continuous stream of carb source, nutrients, and air. And once we have and so basically we have this continuous stream of all these nutrients, and then we have to kind of switch over to stressing out the yeast. So once we build enough of this yeast biomass, we then kind of stress the yeast out, which sounds like a bad thing, but I promise it's a good thing. And then we prepare it for drying. So I kind of like to split this production into two separate parts, right? We have this propagation half, which is the first half that I just described. And then we have this second half, which I like to call the downstream half. And this is really focused on separation, drying, and packaging. So once we move to this downstream, we move to our first separator, which is the centrifuge. And that's really to separate the yeast solids from this nutrient broth. And then we wash the yeast. We do a second separator, and that's to kind of condense and get a good concentration of yeast cells to produce this kind of thick yeast slurry. And that then needs to move to be dried. So we move to our first dryer. The first dryer is actually called this rotary vacuum filter, and it's this big kind of rotating drum, and there's a thin layer of yeast kind of on this drum. And it slowly rotates, and with the vacuum, it dries the yeast down to roughly about 30%. And as the yeast kind of reaches the other side, it's gently scraped off by this scraping blade. So as you can imagine, the yeast isn't really coming off in the little kind of pellets that you normally see dried yeast. So it's kind of in these rippled clumps from the scraper. And we don't really want that. We want what you're used to seeing. So we have to push that through an extruder. And the extruder puts it into these little kind of tiny noodles. Once we have that, we move to our first that's our first dryer. Then we move to our second dryer, which then continually reduces the moisture down to 10%. And then we move to packaging. So that's kind of the basics of the kind of production steps, right? We go from our lab, and then we kind of prop up the culture to make it up to large scale. We do a fed batch system with all those carbs, nutrients, and air. Then we kind of stress all the yeast out. Once we reach that point, we have all that biomass and the yeast is stressed, it's ready for drying. And then we move to kind of the downstream half. And that's where we move to the separator, the washing, second separation, and then the 2 drying steps to packaging. So that's kind of like a really quick overview, kind of like a 10-step thing, I guess. I don't know. So we are going to actually move to the slides. So hopefully you can kind of follow along a bit easier than what I'm doing at this time. All right, so I know that was kind of a lot of information really quick. So we're going to kind of slow it down step by step, as you guys can see here. So again, we start with the culture in a lab, and we eventually get to this large scale fermenter. And instead of using batch propagation, production level prop is done by using a fed batch system. So this means that the propagation fermenter has an air, there we go, there's my little cursor. It has an air, a liquid carbohydrate, and a nutrient source that's added continuously over time at very specific flow rates. So the overall goal at this point is to build lots of yeast and little amounts of alcohol. The carbohydrate source used to feed the yeast is not malt-based wort, but instead it's molasses. So not only is this easily assimilated by yeast, but another positive is that it's actually a gluten-free method, and this is why dried yeast is commonly used in gluten-free or gluten-reduced beers. A nutrient source needs to be added because molasses is not very giving in this areas. In most cases, various vitamins and minerals are necessary for proper propagation. And these nutrients are typically nitrogen and phosphate, minerals such as magnesium and zinc, and all these other kind of vitamins. The addition rates of this nutrients, air, and molasses actually can vary by strain that we're producing. And each parameter is regularly measured, and it can be changed to adapt to the propagation, which I personally think is pretty cool. So at the end of this biomass production phase, we're still here in this large-scale fermenter, but we're changing the kind of conditions very significantly. So aeration is continued to build fatty acids and sterols within the cells, but other parameters are changed to induce stress. And this may sound like a bad thing, but it's actually really good. So stressing out the yeast cell causes it to produce a compound called Trehalose. And in the most basic of terms, it's a yeast stress protectant, and we're going to touch upon this later. But so just remember the term trehalose and yeast stress protectant. So this kind of wraps up the major propagation aspect of this production. So now we're going to turn to this downstream. So this kind of top half up here is all the production propagation, and then down below is this downstream. So first we're pushing it through the first separator, the centrifuge, to separate the solids. The yeast is washed, and the mixture becomes further concentrated by a separator. Now the yeast is a thick cream yeast that needs to be dried. It goes through this rotary vacuum filter, which slowly rotates and gently scrapes the yeast off the giant drum. And this brings the moisture content down to 30%. It passes on through the extruder and moves next to our fluid bed dryer. And this gently kind of tumbles the yeast to kind of break up large clumps. And it's a really important step to regulate, right? If we have the airflow too strong, the yeast cells are going to be kind of pushed around and up through the chamber, see as right through here. And then if temperature control is too high, then it can damage the yeast cell. So temp and airflow controls are really critical at this stage. So then the yeast kind of finally moves to packaging. And thankfully, since active dried yeast has a long shelf life, this gives us plenty of time to run proper QA/QC, genetic testing, and we can even ferment with the strains in our lab before the yeast can be sold. So this next slide is just an example of what the pre-dried yeast extrusion looks like. So as I kind of explained, those little tiny noodles, this is kind of what I'm talking about. And I think this is a good example to see for, if you've never seen this before, or if maybe you've never used dried yeast. And this is before it goes through the second kind of drying step. Okay, so now we're back to there we go. We're back to the webcam. And I really hope that was all clear and pretty understood. And I think this really kind of leads us into the next common question that I get often. And that is really, what is trehalose, and probably why do you talk about it all the time? I briefly kind of described it as this yeast stress protectant, but I think it's actually a lot more than that. And it's a really important aspect of dried yeast, and I think people should know. So I'm going to move back to the slide so you guys can kind of follow along. Okay, so trehalose is actually a sugar. It's a disaccharide, and yeast produce this when they undergo stress. And it plays a really important role in stabilizing the cell membrane during the drying process, which in turn basically makes it a stress protectant. So we're going to kind of take a quick step back into some basic biology here. And we're going to put it in kind of simple terms. But kind of like I said before, I'm a visual learner, and I think that this is a good way to kind of show what's happening, even if it's kind of on a simplified scale. So the cell membranes are comprised primarily of phospholipids, as we see here, right? So we have the hydrophilic heads, and we have the hydrophobic tails. And this really allows the formation of a protective bilayer that encapsulates the inside of the cells. And water plays a really important role in maintaining the fluidity here. So this is really essential for proper membrane function. And in a situation like active dried yeast production, as water is lost during the dehydration, the cell enters kind of this like dormant state, and it undergoes this transition from this kind of functional fluid state, as you can see, to this kind of less functional rigid state, dormant in a sense. So thankfully, with the increase of trehalose, which can actually become 15 to 25% of the total dry weight of an active dried yeast product, the rigid structure formation can be mitigated, and it can lower the chance of cell injury. So it's almost kind of like this membrane structure stabilizer, and it really helps reduce the stress on the cell as it's going through the drying process. And the increase of trehalose is also vital because it's a source of carbohydrate that the yeast can survive on throughout its storage in dry form. So that kind of summarizes up, what is active dried yeast and why do we call it active dried yeast? I think that also explains how it's produced and the importance of trehalose overall. The next question that I have here is probably the most common question that I get, and that is, why are there only so many dried strains in comparison to liquid strains, right? I think obviously as a dry yeast producer, it's pretty obvious to see the strains that we have in comparison, but I think it's a good question for people to ask and for us to answer. So we basically we carefully select strains at Lallemand. And there's really a handful of aspects that we have to look at, okay? So we have to look at flavor production. Is it something unique? Is it something that's going to be different than the strains that we already have available? We kind of have to look at popularity. I mean, it's something that you can't not look at. I mean, are brewers going to be interested in it? Is it going to sell? But really what we have to look at is the strains itself and the ability to dry. So not all strains are actually suitable for going through this drying process, and some are much more sensitive than others, okay? Not all strains are equal. And if we try to dry strains that are very sensitive and cannot handle this drying process, it's not going to be able to fall under our pretty strict specs of viability, and we don't want to do that. So, and then another thing we have to look at is the different strains and their ability to produce trehalose. So some strains don't easily produce it, and so this is why I've mentioned trehalose as a source of carb that yeast have to they use to survive on throughout its storage. Okay, so this plays a really significant role in the long-term shelf life that dry yeast has, and this is why dry yeast is actually able to last for at least 2 years, and some even more. So we have to look at all these factors. We have to look at the production of trehalose. We have to look at its ability to dry. We have to look at if it's unique, and if it's something that people are even interested in to begin with. So with all that being said, thankfully, Lallemand has a goal of launching kind of 1 to 2 new products a year. So this way you guys can kind of have, new and innovative products coming your way, and you guys can have it in your hands. And kind of, as you can see next to me here, there we go. Yeah, right there. So these are all our strains, not all of them, but these are just a few of our strains. But the one I'm pointing to is our newest, there we go. This is really difficult. There. This is our newest Voss strain that we have launched. So this is just a really good example to show, the kind of products that we're trying to come out with. And so the next question that I get, it's also kind of a difficult question that I receive, is do I need to rehydrate the dried yeast, and how do I go about doing that? So the short answer to this question is not really, but it depends. So we used to always recommend rehydration, but we realized that it may not be critical to successful fermentation. So the idea behind rehydration was that you're taking a dry yeast and then it's becoming a liquid yeast. So you're reducing the osmotic stress and you're enhancing this kind of yeast dispersion. And this is also kind of why we would still recommend it for more stressful situations like high gravity or low pH brewing, because you're kind of helping it adjust a little bit easier. But for most brewing environments, it's really okay to dry pitch. And what I always say is if you're already running a successful fermentation with a dry pitch, then continue to do so, okay? And then on the other hand, if you're already running a successful fermentation with a rehydrated pitch and you're comfortable with that rehydration and you are, you're feeling comfortable with your methods and your ability to rehydrate, then again, continue to do so and continue to do what works for you. In the end, what we recommend is do what is comfortable. So if you do choose to rehydrate, these are the current recommendations from Lallemand Brewing. So this is actually a one-pager that we have developed, and if anyone is actually interested in receiving this by email or anything, I'm going to have my email address on the last page, so feel free to contact me and I can send you guys one. I'm not going to read this step by step because I think that might be a little redundant, but as you guys are kind of reading through this, there's just a few things I want to note, okay? So one thing is be aware of the rehydration temperature. Okay, so if it's too cold, the cells can actually leach its contents. And if it's too hot, the proteins are going to denaturize. So you don't want to do with any of that. The best thing to do is keep your rehydration temp around 30 to 35 degrees Celsius, or roughly 86 to 92 degrees Fahrenheit. And the other thing to note is you really don't want to stir your yeast immediately once you have sprinkled it on your rehydration kind of medium, right? It is possible to damage the cell by doing something like this. So let it rest. All right. And we're back again. So the next question is, how do I store dry yeast? You can actually store dry yeast in room temperature for long periods, but you really need to know that the lower the storage temperature, the better the yeast is going to retain its performance characteristics. So ideally, the yeast is going to be kept below 8 degrees Celsius or roughly 46 degrees Fahrenheit. And the nice thing is because this is a really accessible temperature, so most breweries, you tend to keep a few extra bricks laying around in like your cold room. And I think this is a really smart idea in case of any kind of emergency like stuck fermentation or really anything. It's just nice to have on hand. So it's great that that's the temperature that it's needed to be in. But I have to let people know, if you have a package that has lost its vacuum, do not use that package, okay? Once the package is open, the yeast are then exposed to air and humidity. And that's going to then increase the metabolic activity, and it's going to begin to consume its own internal nutrients and carbs, and that's going to then decrease the viability. So if you end up having a soft pack and you received it directly from shipment, please just get in touch with your local Lululemon rep, and they're going to be able to help you. So whatever you do, just don't use a inflated pack. It's not good. And the next question is, do I need to aerate? So on the first pitch of dry yeast, you do not need to aerate. And I think sometimes people don't really believe that, and then they end up aerating anyways, and that's also completely fine. There is no harm done if you choose to aerate. But I want you guys to just know and be aware that you do not have to aerate on the first pitch. So in some situations like high gravity brewing, some oxygenation would be beneficial to promote the synthesis of these unsaturated fatty acids and these sterols. But for most situations, the yeast contains enough of these reserves of the compounds to achieve active growth. But do note that once you have already done your first pitch, any subsequent pitch after that, you're going to need to aerate and treat it just like you would any other kind of normal yeast product that you have in your brewery. So that now leads us to our kind of last question. I feel like I kind of sped through these, you guys. I'm really sorry. All this coffee and energy this morning. So the last question of the day is, can I repitch dried yeast? And the answer is yes. Yes, you totally can repitch dried yeast. You would treat it just like you would any other yeast strain that you have in your brewery, okay? It's nothing that significantly different. It's still yeast. So yeah, that kind of wraps up my frequently asked questions. A few things that I would like to summarize here is, dry yeast is a quality product that can be used at any level, whether it's homebrew or professional brewing. It can be used as a primary house strain, or it could just be another kind of yeast in your brewery yeast toolbox. But I always say that it's a really good lifesaver to have on hand, right? You never know when some kind of brewing yeast emergency is going to come up. So just have something in your cold room on hand that you can use in case of a situation. So again, sorry that I really just ran through all of that, but thank you guys for taking the time to listen in, and I hope you guys are all doing well and staying healthy. And I really I want you guys to know that the Lallman team is here to support and that we still brew with you. It's just kind of online now. So I have one last slide that I'm going to put up, and it's going to show my email address. So in case any of you guys are deciding to kind of log off, or you guys have other things to do and errands to run or meetings to go to, virtual meetings to go to, you guys can kind of grab my email now. And while that's up, I'm going to kind of switch back to the live stream page, see if there's any comments and questions, or maybe see if anyone's saying hi. I don't really know what to expect, so we're going to see. So yeah, thanks guys. I'll be looking at questions now. All right, so it looks like my whole team is here, which is great. All right, so we have one question from a Brian, and he asks, when will the Gavike 11 grams be available in the US? So we actually have, from my understanding, now the 11 grams are available in the US. I know that I have seen them. If you're in the United States, I think you get these. It depends on if you are a retailer or if you are a home brewer. Retailers, I think they can now start ordering them to have them in their shops for home brewers to then buy. It's a really great strain. Oh, and I just see that Erin Glass has just said that she would message you. She is in charge of our homebrew sales, so she will be helping you out. Okay, I see one that says, can you save a package of dried yeast? So this is actually a really good question that we get, and we get it pretty often. And that is, let's say if you already have a package of dry yeast, let's say you have a brick and you only want to use a half, then you would, so you want to save it. Okay, so the simple answer to this is yes, you can. You just have to be careful. Okay, so use what you want, and then you need to get all the air out of it as much as possible. And then once you have all that air removed, you need to seal it. So the best way that I recommend people to do this is actually having a vacuum sealer, and then those little vacuum sealing bags. And with those vacuum sealing bags, just get all that oxygen out of it. And once all that oxygen is out, then I would say put it in like cool, or better is probably freezing conditions. And then you could probably use that yeast within I would say use it probably within 3 days or so. All right. Okay, so, and I see a similar question from Simon about, can we use half a pack of dried yeast and then vacuum seal the other half to prevent contamination? That's kind of similar to what I just said. You can definitely try to save that yeast. It's a very common question we get. Just the major thing is you want to get all that air, all that oxygen out of it as much as possible, and then put it in those kind of freezing conditions, and then use it within those few days. Oh, thank you guys for all the nice comments and everything too. All right. Let's see. How many repitches can you get out of a dried yeast? So, I guess this answer is kind of, it depends. Okay, so you can have, one, depends on what you're brewing. Obviously, if you're fermenting a soured wort, low pH conditions, you're probably not going to get much use out of that yeast afterwards. The best thing to do, I would say on average, most breweries get like 5 to 10 generations, maybe 8. But again, it also depends if you're doing that kind of really stressful situations, it's going to have an effect on the yeast and stuff like that. Okay, so the next question is, let's see. I'm just waiting for them to kind of pop up. So I see, what temp should the packet be stored at? My homebrew shop stores it in room temp. So I kind of mentioned this. Dry yeast, it can be stored in room temperatures, but the lower the storage temperature, the better that the yeast is going to retain its performance characteristics. And so it's much like I would highly recommend to, store the yeast probably below 8 degrees Celsius or 46 degrees Fahrenheit. So 46 degrees Fahrenheit, for most, and that's very, so refrigerated conditions would be kind of the best, temperature range. Would it be possible? Unfortunately, yes, you could see the slides again. I know that this is alive right now, but this is going to be available on the Lallman Brewing page, and you're going to be able to watch it over and over again, and you're going to have with the webcam and my voice over the slides as well. So I recommend once this is all over, you're going to have all that information. How long can we keep open yeast packets? That's actually a really good question. I actually don't know the exact time limit of keeping the yeast packet open itself and before that would start having an effect on viability. As you see my email on this slide, please feel free to shoot me an email with this question and I'll get you in touch with someone who can definitely answer that for you. And let's see. Okay, so yeah, I see you here. Sorry, I must have missed your question, John. It says there is some confusion / disagreement on the number of cells per gram in dry yeast when using an online homebrew site calculators. Can you address that during this conversation? So there is a difference between, this is why we actually recommend pitching dry, because this is a question that we get all the time. On our Lallman webpage, we actually have a pitching rate calculator. You'll find it under our brewing tools tab. And this will kind of help you figure out how to pitch when you're using this dry weight method. So it's a little bit different than doing a cell count, and I understand that. I think actually next week, or at least the next live stream that we do, my colleague Dan from Australia, he's going to be going over cell counting and viability and pitch rates and things like this, and I think he's even going to be live streaming from a lab and doing this all live. So it's going to be really interesting. I really hope you guys can kind of come and check it out, and he will be able to 100% clear that up as well. But I recommend checking out our website for the dry pitch calculator. All right. Okay, so now we have like a multi-question. It says, I have some expired packets of dried yeast. How is the viability and vitality affected as the packet sits longer? So this is a really good question. So we have expiration dates on our dried yeast packets. This isn't like an end all by any means, okay? It's okay, sorry, I'm getting a little frazzled on accident. So it's not an end all. This just kind of means that this is when we see we have our yeast specs, and that's kind of when we see the yeast maybe not falling under those yeast specs so much anymore, right? It's kind of like that's kind of our limit. And when you have an expired yeast, it doesn't mean that it's all completely doesn't work. It's not dead. It's, it doesn't work. It's just that the viability might be decreasing slightly. So what I would say, let's say if you're a brewer and you have your spare yeast for emergencies in your cooler, and you find this case and you say, you find it and you find that it's maybe a few months expired. I would not say to throw it away completely. I would recommend to get in touch with your local Lallman rep, and they're going to be able to help you possibly adjust pitching rates to make up for that possible change in viability and stuff like that. But if you have an expired, and that's for like 500 grams. If you have like an 11 grams, same thing, but maybe for 11 grams, it's such a small packet, might just try to find another one or something. Okay, so I don't really see any more questions currently. I'm just gonna, and we're hitting around 35 minutes, which was kind of like my goal. I don't want to make this too long or go on, forever. So let's just go back to this webcam so I can say bye to you guys. So yeah, thank you guys so much for all the questions. If there's any that pop in afterwards, I'll try to comment and answer, or if there's any that I somehow kind of missed. But thank you guys for, again, tuning in, saying hi, and taking time out of your day to just kind of learn a little bit about dried yeast. I really appreciate it, and I hope you guys are all doing well, and Lallman is still here to brew with you. So thank you guys, and I really hope you have a good Monday or, morning, evening, wherever it's at. So see you guys.